Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our chat with the Executive Director of Bay Area Turning Point. My name is Melissa Prentice. I'm the Outreach Education and Prevention Manager.
My name is Miriam Musa. I'm the Outreach Education Prevention Coordinator.
And today we're going to be discussing sexual assault awareness. We're going to be discussing the sexual assault movement and prevention and how racial equity plays a role in prevention with our Executive Director, Brenda Sykes.
Hello, Melissa and Miriam and everybody out there in social media land. Yes, we're going to have the conversation about racial equity and sexual assault and prevention. And I know it's a chat with the executive director, but it's a chat with all of us because we all have perspectives. We all have various backgrounds and we serve various individuals in the community. So it's a comprehensive conversation about racial equity and sexual assault and prevention.
Yes, we're really excited to have this conversation with y'all today. So just to give you a little background on Sexual Assault Awareness and Prevention Month. April is Sexual Assault Awareness and Prevention Month. And this movement is about, well, let me back up. Sexual Assault Awareness and Prevention Month is about 22 years old. It was officially established in 2001. However, the sexual assault movement really started back in the 1940s. So this really started with the civil rights movement. There were intersections between race-based violence and gender-based violence, a term that we now use called intersectionality. And this continued through the 1970s, where social activism around sexual assault continued to gain traction. In 1971, in San Francisco, the first Rape Crisis Center was opened. And then in 1994, the Violence Against Women Act was enacted, which established funding and support for survivors of sexual violence. So what I want to get us started with is, how did everybody in this room get involved with the sexual assault movement? Brenda, I know you've been in the movement since about 2004.
Yes. So when I postgraduate school, I started to work for a nonprofit. And while I was there, I had this mentor by the name of Pat Chambers, who was a sexual assault advocate extraordinaire. So she brought me on as a board member after some careful persuasion to bring me on as a board member. And it was called Morning into Dancing Ministry. And it was a ministry designated to individuals who had never spoken about their sexual abuse out. There was never an outcry. They didn't seek any services, but there was not a platform for them to have the conversation. And so, as the vice president of the board at that time, I was bewildered by the fact that individuals had experienced extreme sexual abuse and never talked about it. So I witnessed this one lady, I don't recall her name, but I saw her relive her trauma in that moment during a group session. And for me, yeah, this is something that I have to be a part of. And I also have some family stuff as it relates to sexual abuse. Nobody likes to talk about it, but most families have conversations related to sexual abuse. And so for me, when I was planted here, I made sure my personal mission was to work towards ending sexual abuse and domestic violence, but particularly sexual abuse.
That sounds like a really cool program.
Yes, Morning into Dancing Ministries. Don't even know if it still exists. I know that's what started me along this pathway.
That was around whenever I was younger. I'll go next. I got involved in the sexual assault movement because I am a survivor myself. So my victimization happened whenever I was a teenager, and it took me several years to actually realize that that's what happened to me, because we didn't really have that kind of education. We didn't have those conversations when I was a teenager. And so once I finally figured that out, probably around 18 or 19 years old, that started kind of messing with my head a little bit. And then it really hit me whenever I was about 22. And since then, I kept wondering, what can I do? What can I do to make sure that this doesn't happen to anybody else? And honestly, I wanted to go into law. I wanted to become a prosecutor, put all sexual offenders behind bars. That did not happen. I did get a legal studies degree, but that degree actually came with me here to Bay Area Turning Point. And it was while I was here being an advocate for sexual assault victims that are sexual assault survivors that I realized that this is where I'm supposed to be. This is what I'm supposed to be doing.
Well, I think for me, I think I'm the newest to the movement. I recently graduated with a master's in public health. So during that time, we did a lot of community outreach, a lot of education, like health education. And I kind of realized that I did have a history of sexual assault in my family, and it just wasn't anything that was ever spoken about. It was normalized. It's just kind of unfortunate reality that women go through in, especially in my culture being Southeast Asian, that it's just something that you just move past. It's something that's very normal. It's normalized, unfortunately. So I realized I wanted to do something to break down that barrier of like normalizing it, especially within our community here in Houston, since we do have such a big Southeast Asian population. So I wanted to, once I learned about Bay Area Turning Point, I was like, okay, I have to join. I have to use my fresh knowledge on educating the public. And I just knew I wanted to get involved in and help other women.
That's where you say sexual assault is a public health issue.
It is definitely
Absolutely.
100%.
Thank you. I was just about to ask her that question. And that kind of leads into the next question. What does the sexual assault movement mean to you?
I think it means, like I said, it means bringing it to the surface, talking about it, like teaching the younger generation like methods and preventing it from happening in the first place with people that are going through it, letting them know it's okay to talk about it, that it's not normal, that it's not something that you did to deserve it. It's nothing that should just be like swept under the rug. So I think that's a big thing. I'm a huge advocate for providing people the resources to have a comfortable place to come and share their story and find the help they need. And making sure people know that we exist too. So that they know it's a place to come to.
Absolutely. I think for me, it goes a little bit deeper because whenever we hear about sexual violence, there's a stigma attached to that. A lot of people don't want to talk about it. And I mean, it's an uncomfortable subject. But also, whenever we think about sexual violence, we're thinking whenever we think about prevention, we're thinking surface level. And that's what I always like to challenge people to get beneath is the surface. So one of the questions that I ask in our crisis intervention training, our new staff training, I always ask the question, what would a violence-free society look like? And a lot of the answers that I get are, like I said, pretty surface level. There's no police. Everybody can run around outside without the fear of getting kidnapped or snatched up. Things like that. You can keep your doors unlocked. But what about going deeper than that? What are our systems going to look like? What are our institutions going to look like? And whenever it comes to the sexual assault movement, that's what we have to do is focus on all those different factors. So the racial equity, the gender equity, the systems, the institutions, the media. We have to focus on all of that stuff and challenging that rape culture.
Okay. Well, thank you for that, Miriam and Melissa. And I'll take it to this point. As a woman of color in the fourth largest county in the United States of America, who would eventually, in a few years, went to this United Way information session, and they said how Harris County will be Black and brown in so many years. But there's lack of education invested into ensuring that those individuals have adequate access. So my role here is to help all survivors. I have survivors within my family. So there's a personal connection, but there's also, a personal connection that we form at a macro level to make sure that individuals of color are sitting at the table that's representative of who we serve, that's breaking down the barriers in the systems, elevating the voices of survivors, all survivors, but particularly those whose voices have been diminished by the systems that you mentioned earlier. And to bring awareness to, like you mentioned, cultural things that impede on individuals' abilities to access service. So all of those things are why. That's why, that's what the sexual assault movement means to me.
So this month's theme for Sexual Assault Awareness and Prevention Month is drawing connection. Prevention demands equity. So we hear the term equity, we hear the term equality, and some people might not know that even though they'll mistakenly use it interchangeably, they don't actually mean the same thing. There's actually key significant differences to it. So if you define it, equality is giving individuals or a group of people the same resources and opportunities, while equity is recognizing that each person has different circumstances and it allocates the exact resources and opportunities needed to reach an equal outcome. So like an example I like to give, a very common example to give when you try to teach about equity, you visualize 3 people looking over a fence. That's the best visual. One person is really tall and they can easily see over the fence. They don't really need any help. The middle person is average height. They can just kind of see over the fence, but they need a little help. The third person is very short. They're completely blocked from view. They have no access to the other side and to see what's going on. If you were to provide equality in the situation, you give them each a step stool that's the same height, allocating the same amount of resources. The tall person, they can already see, but now they're getting even
Now
better.
they're towering over.
Now they're towering. Now they're like, oh, I can put my hands over, everything's great. The middle person, they can see now, but the short individual, they still can't see. They're still blocked by that fence. In equity, the tall person, since they can already see, they wouldn't be allocated any resources. The middle person would be given 1 step stool. And the third person who's short, he would be given 2 or 3.
Mhm.
They would be given 2 or 3 so that they can see. So meaning everybody at the end, it's the same result, but you allocate the resources differently. And in the end, it's more effective and you recognize that there are differences within individuals and key groups. That's why equity is quite different from equality.
So I'm glad we're having this conversation because everyone likes to say they're incorporating DEI policies
Mhm.
and they're taking the steps towards diversity, equity, and inclusion. But equity is severely independent of a lot of other things like diversity
Mhm.
and inclusion. Equity is a part of those things as well, but racial equity in specifically means something completely different than how it's used for. Like you mentioned, and I've seen what you're referencing.
Yeah.
I've seen that.
I think I've seen it on LinkedIn or some other places. But at the end of the day, when you talk about racial equity, when you have systems historically and modern systems that take communities and marginalize them, or their barriers such as healthcare, law enforcement, criminal justice, economic, lack of mental health. When you attribute all those factors into certain cultures, certain people of color, then that's adding these layers to an already complex situation. So sexual assault, nobody wants to talk about it. It's taboo. I was trying to do some research and I'm like, where are the most recent stats that
Mhm.
talks about sexual assault? So when you already don't talk about it, and then when there are marginalized communities severely impacted by it, and even the data that's there represents non-BIPOC. And for those that don't know, BIPOC is Black, Indigenous, people of color. So the data that's there represents non-BIPOC. When you add all of those complexities to the situation, it's imperative that we have the conversation. And racial equity, particular to the sexual assault movement, means breaking down those barriers, having representation throughout your organization so people walk through the doors and they feel comfortable, right? We want individuals for all walks of life because we serve individuals from all walks of life. However, racial equity means sometimes accompanying to somebody to the police station because the police doesn't have the best relationship with all cultures or all people of color. Going to a hospital where there's been disparity, I mean, you could do all the research in the world, just do Google healthcare disparities. People of color will rise to the top. And so when we talk about racial equity in this movement, it's addressing all those systems and barriers. And not just the systems and the barriers, but within our own community as well. Most sexual assault victims are sexually assaulted by someone in their community. So there's an extreme lack of education. So when you couple the systems that are primarily designed for non-BIPOC or was designed by non-BIPOC individuals, and you couple that with the lack of education in the BIPOC community, it's a recipe for disaster. That's why there's a lack of resources. That's why we're testifying for bills to help get access. So there's a myriad of things that are happening. And so that's good that we're having a conversation about racial equity, specifically when it comes to sexual assault and prevention.
So you already mentioned how sexual assault impacts the BIPOC community differently than other communities. Can you kind of go a little bit more into that about how it impacts them more?
So
Kind of
historic,
talking about two numbers.
yes. Well, I don't know if I'll get too much into numbers
Mhm.
because statistics change and I have to cite sources and my memory isn't the best. But I will say this, sexual violence was used to control immigrant women and people of color historically. It was used as fear tactics and ways to keep communities scared so they would not thrive. So that's going way back to, slavery and even before. We live in a patriarchal society. We're working really hard, but that's society is designed and controlled by men. And so when you live in that kind of society and all the things that come with it, you have to look at the historical perspective, which, we don't like to talk about it, but it's true, right? Sexual violence was used to control people and to keep communities marginalized. But modern day, like today, Black and Hispanic women particularly are considered promiscuous. And then that's used against them even within their own communities, which further validates why they won't seek services, why it's underreported, why you can't have much movement when it comes to BIPOC individuals and sexual assault because it is not reported. And in part because of the systems and how things are designed. So just watch. I don't even know. It used to be BET videos back when I was younger. I don't know what it is now. But if you watch videos and how women are portrayed in those videos,
Like the music videos.
like the music videos, and it becomes normalized. And then you have children thinking social media runs the world, right? And streaming services. Now you have children thinking that that's the way to go. But I will point out that intimate partner violence is 30 to 50% higher in women of color. And IPV does include sexual abuse.
Mhm.
So people of color are being impacted at alarming rates. It's underreported. There's lack of education. And so Bay Area Turning Point, the agencies like Bay Area Turning Point and others have to work really hard to bring down those barriers.
Yeah, and that's a part of also what we're gonna be getting into, and you were talking about lack of resources, lack of education, or lack of education. Um, our systems and our institutions are really broken
Mhm.
whenever it comes to sexual assault survivors in general, but especially whenever it comes to the BIPOC community.
Yes.
So can you go a little bit into that about how some of these specific systems are broken whenever it comes to serving the BIPOC
Well, the
and
fact
sexual assault survivors?
that there's not a lot of focus on sexual assault to even start the conversation,
Uh-huh.
even with non-BIPOC individuals. And that's at agencies like Bay Area Turning Point, that's in your schools, right? That's in your civic organizations, your social clubs. People don't want to talk about, but it's one in how many people have been sexually assaulted. And we have all these gatherings and people don't want to have the discussion. In the criminal justice system specifically, I don't know if anybody's ever watched, I forget the name of it, but it shows the barriers from somebody going through the criminal justice system from the start of it, from the protection order all the way down through all of the various entities they have to go through. It's a very complex system. Well, if the system was designed by non-people of color and to access it, it becomes complex, that's a deterrent. That's why individuals, people of color, are not accessing those services, right? Let's not even get into when you do actually go and you press charges, you go through the criminal justice system, you are literally re-victimized. Because in a patriarchal society, we ask the question, what did the survivor or the victim do? Not why does the perpetrator do, why does he do what he does or she does? Because it impacts men and women. So those are some of the barriers. Law enforcement. I don't know about you all, but I'm a person of color. Law enforcement, if I'm talking to someone on the hotline about accessing, if you're experiencing something, your first line of defense is law enforcement. But what's being reported, and let me be perfectly clear, I'm not saying all law enforcement, but what the media portrays and what's going on is people of color dying at the hands of law enforcement. Am I going to be the one to call law enforcement if I've been sexually assaulted? Especially if it's somebody within my community that's also a person of color. And I lack the education because it's not talked about in schools. And I'm not access to agency like Bay Area Turning Point to walk me through it because being the fourth largest county, we don't have thousands of DV and SA agencies, right? Or even if I do try to access service because we're short-staffed and underfunded, I may or may not get access. So it's all of those complexities. We could talk about numbers all day long,
Mhm.
but it's the complexities associated with those numbers for why people of color just don't access services or they don't. Like, I remember Tisha Jenkins, I was at a training and she went and just perused Black women in particular. One of their children, one of the girls in the community was kidnapped. She was kidnapped. She was being held against her will and she was being sexually assaulted. The community responded by a group of Black women getting together to go find her. They didn't call the police. They didn't call the sexual assault center. They didn't call those entities. They band together to go find the young lady and to pull her out of that situation. That speaks volumes to why we have to have the conversations. We have to create like environments for people to feel comfortable in the schools all the way. See, we don't want you to come to Bay Area Turning Point because we don't want sexual violence to be an issue, right? So we're the reactive. Proactive is doing the prevention work, inserting yourself in the community so that people are educated and informed and not made to feel shame. For experience, to your point earlier, in the Asian specific, I'm sorry, I don't want to misquote, Southeast Asian community. I know there's an organization that works specifically with that community, but they're not made to feel shame for something that you're just supposed to go on. When in your community that's the case, but in your out, the world is telling you you deserve better. But within my community, so it's the cultural factors, right? So religious factors as well. It's just societal factors in these criminal justice system, entities, including law enforcement, you know, the courts. Those are contributing to why it's very hard for the BIPOC community to access services.
And I think you mentioned earlier too, when we first started talking about this topic, that even within hospitals, medical
Yes.
settings, there's a sense of distress, and it's something I wanted to talk about, that there's a reason for that, that
Yes.
even to this day, like racial and ethnic minorities, they receive a lower quality of healthcare despite having a similar income, insurance added status, age, severity of illness as their white counterparts. There's distress because even to this day, there are these like fake physiological myths that are still portrayed in the medical community, that Black individuals feel less pain. That's the thing. That's the thing. Some doctors believe that they feel less pain because they believe their skin is thicker or that their nerve endings are less sensitive. There's the issue of Black individuals being overly diagnosed with mental health conditions. There's the higher mortality rate for Black pregnant women. So all of these things, they also contribute to the just general mistrust of the medical community. So when people say, hey, if you become sexually assaulted, why aren't you going to, the emergency room with a doctor afterwards to get it recorded?
Absolutely.
Why aren't you going? Why aren't you getting it like certified? Why aren't you getting everything tested? Because they don't have the trust in the system. Even at that basic level of healthcare that everyone should have an equal access to, just a trust in someone that should be knowledgeable in medicine. You should have that trust in them. But it's not consistent even in that setting.
Absolutely. And there's some organizations that offer these services free of charge. And yet people are still hesitant to access. If you just take it back not that far from the Stevie experiment,
Yep.
I just remember when the COVID pandemic was happening, and people were bringing up all of these historical things that had happened to prevent them from trusting. Those things are real for people. They're real for individuals, and I'm hands off. I don't want to access any medical entity. Well, we know that healthcare is the least thing the individuals impacted by DV and sometimes SA. They're trying to deal with the crisis. Healthcare is at the low end of priorities, but if you don't take care of yourself, if you don't access, it's just going to create a snowball effect in so many other areas.
Yeah, absolutely. And you brought up something about, lacking education. Yes, we do lack the education in schools. We're trying to achieve that. We're trying to get this education in schools. But again, like we were saying earlier, the sexual assault awareness movement is only, 20-something years old. That started in 2001. That's whenever I was in high school. And so it kind of makes sense that that's whenever it was like really started, that at my age in high school, I would never see that education, but it has been picking up steam since then. So why are we still lacking this education in our schools? Why, I understand it's difficult to talk about. I understand people don't want to talk about it. They don't want to acknowledge that their kids are going to get into these kind of situations. But it's without the proper education, that's almost impossible to expect.
So that is uh, a loaded question, a loaded statement, because as with much progress that it has been, we have regrets in some areas. And so unfortunately, our children are living in a time of our youth where we're told uh, awareness is brought, but then there's systems or laws that are then
Mhm.
curtailing that. And I beg to differ. I think the sexual assault movement did not. It's maybe it got labeled in 20 something years ago, but it's been going on for a very long time. But then when you have individuals, and so I will say Barry Triple has no political stance on anything. However, we advocate for survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. So when you're in the schools and you're talking about healthy relationships, and you're talking about boundaries, and you talk about the fact that sexual assault does happen in schools, right? Now, I'm a youth, a person of youth. For sexual assault, the main age is between what, 18 to 24. So you're talking about those coming out of high school or those going into college campuses. Not that it doesn't happen to anyone else, but particularly that age group, that demographic, right? Not really established. Don't really have a lot going on for you. But then we hear from those that we serve that coercion is real. It's a real thing for those who we serve, right? So we're in the communities talking about healthy relationship. We're hearing that coercion is a real thing, but then in the media you get hit with, hey, this is being overturned, and here's the impact. And then all of the backing, regardless of what side you're on behind it. So it's hard to manage when you're a person that's in that scope. You're trying to establish yourself. We know sexual assault happens on college campuses often, right? It's underreported, but now when you already don't have enough education on those, and we're talking about what we don't have, but we will start talking about what we need to do. So for those listening, don't want you to just think we're being negative. But when you couple all of those, lack of education, lack of exposure, and then you're people that are impacted by things such as coercion, because sexual assault, we know, is not just strangers. Sometimes it's individuals that, mainly it's individuals.
Most of them.
80% is individuals that you know, and cultures and communities. And now, if something happens as a result of that, I now no longer have that right. We're talking about progression. Yes, we're talking about it. We want to get into schools, but on a systemic level, when you do something to counter that, you create this cesspool of indecisiveness, not knowing where to go, what to do, what I should do, what I shouldn't do. And so we can talk about education on the front end that can help mitigate some of that, right? But we also want to talk about just what people face that have been impacted. Violence is part of society. I've heard you say that. So when you told me to close my eyes, I'm like, I don't know what she's talking about. I can't imagine. It's just a bit of times you can watch shows. It's just part of it, going out and getting land and killing people and all of that was just the way, right? But violence is a part of society. But in the civil society, more civil society, you want to make sure that you don't impart things at the local, regional, national, federal level to make people resistant to what are you really talking about? You're saying this, but I thought I was in a healthy relationship with somebody that I knew, and then this happened. But then the consequences of it. So those are real things for people. And so we have to have a conversation about all those things.
We do. And, it really does start on that individual level, getting people to reframe the way that they think about things, because a lot of people are very set in their ways.
Yes.
And they participate in what we are considering rape, or what we're calling rape culture, which is basically normalizing sexual violence. We're saying this is going to be here, it's not going anywhere. So people are participating in rape culture and they're not even, half the time, they don't even realize it. Whenever they get called on it, they're saying things like, oh, you're just too sensitive. Grow thick skin, grow thicker skin. Whenever in actuality, they're just perpetuating sexual violence. And a lot of times this is even people in the movement too. So, I mean, we definitely want to address this on a systemic level, but how are we going to do that if we can't even get individuals to change their minds?
Well, that's why we have our outreach, education, and prevention.
That's what we're working on.
That's why we have individuals who go out in the communities and explain. And not in a punitive way, because people really do lack knowledge. People, like you mentioned earlier, you didn't really know what sexual abuse was or sexual violence was until you got older, even though you had been exposed at a younger age. You mentioned that you had something in your family that you really didn't know. That's lack of education. So getting in front of individuals, even if we can't get in schools, trying to get in schools, get into aftercare programs, civic organizations, parent groups, so that we can have a conversation. Because if we start educating and parents start in the community, not just parents, the community starts having the conversation, we can combat some of this lack of education at the individual level, right? So Bay Area Turning Point investing into making sure we have outreach, education, and prevention department, which we hope to grow, so that we can go out and spread awareness so that individuals know. So that's one way to combat it. Not making individuals feel like they're uneducated because they don't know a component that society doesn't want to talk about in the first place. Meeting people where they are culturally, understanding their culture, and then adapting your verbiage or your language to that, and not being punitive in it and conveying the message.
Social utility.
Yes,
Exactly.
all those things. Yes.
I think that kind of leads into the next question that I had, which was how do we here at Bay Area Turning Point kind of get back onto the subject of focusing on the BIPOC community? How is Bay Area Turning Point supporting the BIPOC community in relation to the sexual assault movement?
Well, not to brag on Bay Area Turning Point, but I will take the liberty to do that. Bay Area Turning Point, along with the board of directors, has invested into making sure at every level of the organization, we're representative of who we serve. So having people of color in leadership that makes the decisions so that you can respond, hiring and building your programs to reflect that, being in tune to what's going on and responding to that. That's one way. Going to Capitol Day and advocating with legislation to say, hey, let's go out there. This is what we need for all survivors, not just BIPOC, all survivors, including BIPOC survivors, even more so because they need access to services, training, conversation of what the difference between equality and equity is, understanding how your emotional intelligence plays into how you respond to things. Making sure from the onboarding to exit that people understand that's not the only thing, but that's a huge part of what we do. I'm proud to say that we're that type of organization, to make sure that we're doing that and heavily investing in those things so that we can properly respond. We went from having no outreach, education, and prevention department to one person. Now we have two people, and we plan on growing that even more so. To me, that's how you respond to the need at the individual level. Then at the state level, you testifying to Congress to pass bills that helps all survivors of sexual assault, including the BIPOC community, elevating the voices of the BIPOC community particularly, and that way as well. TASA Task Force, Texas Association Against Sexual Assault, being members of organizations like that and participating in presenting at conferences, which is what we're doing. Yes, to make sure that we're incorporating those elements throughout everything that we do. To me, that's how you respond, right? And so, and working with Gloria Terry or Rose Luna, which talks to the federal government and sometimes the state on our behalf, making sure we're participating in any effort to address it, issues with BIPOC community. And I don't know if y'all noticed, but in a lot of platforms, that has been one of the leading discussion points, talking about the BIPOC community in its response. So Bay Area Turning Point, having a board that supports those efforts and understands those efforts. Bay Area Turning Point has even gone so far that there's a DEI committee, an ad hoc committee with our board of directors. So we're making great strides. There's still a lot of work to do. But as long as we have leaders that understand, we want to support all survivors, but they understand the unique barriers to people of color, I think we can do. We have, and we will continue to do great work.
Okay, so, and I think you really kind of talked about this in your answer on how we're equipped to serve the BIPOC community.
Mhm.
Do you have anything else to add on that?
Well, as long as I'm sitting in this seat, in this role, making sure that we are serving the BIPOC community, and it's not just me, I'm joking, but it's a collective effort. We're fortunate enough to have individuals in every department, from development, finance, client service, administration, that understands and responding to that. And Miriam, you're new.
Yeah.
You tell us what's been your experience as it relates to how we incorporate addressing the needs of BIPOC.
I mean, anything just in the office setting, you just see the diversity, whether in the office, as you see that anytime there are trainings, there's some like intervention trainings, we do bring that into account. We do talk about the different effects of sexual assault on various communities, BIPOC, LGBTQ, like we really make sure that we have the training and that we learn like the correct language in terms of both the BIPOC community and LGBT community and helping them and, you know, providing them resources. So it was pretty cool for me. Like it was my first time being in a job setting where it's so emphasized and it's like it's in a positive manner too.
Yes.
Like in a very positive manner. It's nothing that if you're ever like, oh, I didn't know this, no one's like, oh, I can't believe you didn't know this. So you're talked down to, like it's very open, welcoming, and like you feel better. I don't know, you feel like you're better equipped to help people in any field, honestly. Yeah. Right. If I ever choose to move on from working with domestic violence, sexual assault victims, I think what I learned from here with working with the BIPOC community will help me in any future careers as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm bragging on Bay Area Turning Point, but we do all of that so that when individuals who identify as BIPOC walk through our doors, we can adequately respond to them. Because that's what we're here for. We're not here for my own personal agenda. We're not here for any of our own personal agenda. We're here to respond to the need of survivors. And so that hasn't always been a part of what we've done. We've always served everyone, but we didn't pay attention to specific barriers because we wanted to we're just serving everyone. We have a enhanced understanding. Don't like to use the word better. An enhanced understanding of how we have to identify the inequities so that those communities can access services or feel comfortable in accessing services.
And I want to mention, like, it's something that I think you guys have been really great about. Like, I identify as being from the Southeast Asian community. That's something that I've even brought up in my interview, that it's something I feel very passionate about helping them. And having an open environment, a welcoming environment of, like, again, I'm pretty new. Some places wouldn't do that, but higher ups taking into account my thoughts, what I think we should be doing, what direction we should be future programs, future, events in, that it's being taken into account and seriously considered, and it's not just kind of like disregarded due to the fact they're new. It's huge.
Well, we can't become like the systems that we're fighting against.
Yeah.
So if you don't want to be controlled, manipulated, and all of those things, we most certainly don't want our staff. That goes against everything we stand for. So that's good to hear as a new employee that we are making. I'm pretty sure other people watching are glad to hear that as well. So it's like, it's not even a thought. It's just part of what it's a thought, but there's not any, we can't do that. That's just who we are. That's what we want to do. And we want individuals to feel just as comfortable as you have so far. So thanks for that.
So you brought up a good point. You said something about talking down to people that don't understand what we're trying to get across. And I find that, and y'all correct me if I'm wrong, if you haven't seen this, but what I've noticed is people have a lot of difficulty communicating whenever they don't understand something. So what I've noticed is people start using very aggressive language whenever you were trying to educate them on something that they don't understand. So we're challenging these risk factors that are contributing to sexual violence. One of those being any kind of racist attitudes or homophobic attitudes. So how do we get the community members that feel threatened whenever they're challenged? How do we get them to understand, like, we're not trying to threaten you, we're trying to educate you, and this is a good thing?
So without knowing too much of what you're referring to, my assumption is it's probably a certain demographic that's responding in a way that has power and influence, and they want to maintain power and influence. And so I don't necessarily think it's lack of knowledge or lack of education. I think it's it's not wanting to lose power and control, which is what we fight against as well. So depending on who I'm talking to. So first, what I had to do personally was, because if you got defensive with me, I'm not going to get defensive immediately back. I create boundaries. We can have a conversation. So if I'm talking to, let's just say it's a school and trying to get individuals to understand, I'm personalizing it to those in that school. And if you're affiliated with it, then you must have a heart for it. And if you don't, you're in the wrong place. And so personalizing it. When I'm talking to a business owner, bringing it to the bottom line, because that's what they care about often, right? If I'm talking to a parent, maybe bringing up, because I'm a parent. So I'm having to curtail, for me, it will be curtailing depending on who my audience is. But also understanding, just like we've always had violence in society, you're always going to have ignorance. You're always going to have individuals that don't want to change. That can't prevent you from having the conversations, because there's somebody in that crowd that does. Somebody that really may have lack of education, but you may have exposed them to something, and now it's changing their mindset. It's changing their mindset. It may potentially change those that they surround, right mindset. So I'm not going to get so caught up in trying to change somebody's ideology or view of me, right? But I'm going to elevate the conversation, period. And either you can catch on or you can't, but that's not going to stop us from doing what we do. Thank you for that.
Well, and really to wrap up, what are some of our next steps as an organization at Barrier Turning Point, as individuals? What are our next steps in supporting the sexual assault movement, as far as ourselves as individuals, the people that we serve, the systems?
Okay.
Sure.
I think, given my title of outreach, education, prevention, furthering that, getting into more communities, the ones that I'm so passionate about, trying to find a way in and educating and, letting them know that we're here. Like, we're a great organization, that we offer so many services for domestic violence, sexual assault victims, that just, again, educating them on the fact that we're here and just even teaching them about prevention. So I think those are the next steps for me, of really focusing on that, increasing the populations that we address.
And I think, we have to address sexual violence on several different levels. You're somewhat familiar with the prevention. Y'all are familiar with the prevention. So we have different levels that we're trying to work on. We have the individual level, we have the relationship level, we have the community level, we have the societal level. The societal level is a lot of what we've been touching on today, but we are actually kind of involved in that level currently. So me being on TASA's Sexual Assault Survivor Advisory Board, and also on the Survivor Center Working Group for the Office of the Governor's Sexual Assault Task Force and the Safety Planning Working Group. We're making recommendations for policy change in Texas. Like you've said a couple of times, we've written testimony for several bills that are on the table, and these bills really are focusing on survivors' rights. So kind of going back to the educational piece of things, not necessarily just in schools, but on our rights in general as survivors, because we do have rights as survivors, but there is no way to enforce those rights, and it says it right there in the statute, unfortunately. So that's what we're actually working on right now, is making sure that there is some way to enforce those rights. One of these bills being providing legal representation for victims.
Mhm.
That's a right that every single offender has, is right to representation.
Mhm.
You don't have an attorney, one will be provided to you.
Right.
Victims don't have that right.
Right.
So that's one of the bills on the table, and it's not necessarily to represent the case or to bring down law enforcement. It's mainly to make sure that our rights are being enforced.
Right.
So the other piece of that, yes, we can easily look up what our rights are, but if y'all have ever looked at statute language, it is not fun to try to figure out what they're saying.
Right.
So something that is actually available to everybody on the Office of the Governor's Sexual Assault Task Force website under Survivor Resources is a guide that was created that actually breaks down all of the sexual assault survivors' rights that are available to where you can understand it, and it goes in the order of the process. So if you decide to go get an exam at the hospital, it gives you your rights as far as going to get that medical exam. And then if you decide to report to law enforcement, it moves to that side. What are your rights as far as law enforcement is concerned? And then it goes into the criminal justice system where it's going to court, being prosecuted. So, and another bill that's on the table too is making sure that peace officers, whenever they're responding to these sexual assault cases, that they are providing these rights in writing to the victims. Because I can't even throw out a number how many hotlines I've taken where I've spoken to survivors of either domestic violence or sexual assault, and they reported it, and I asked them questions regarding their rights, and they're like, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. I didn't know I had that right. So it's important that we're informing them of their rights, but on the other side of that, we're really instilling these healthy behaviors in people, which is why we're starting at a young age, because the youth of today are leaders of the future. And so if we're constantly stuck in these patterns of, like you were saying earlier, the patriarchy, unfortunately, white males being the ones in power, we're not going to be able to instill these healthy behaviors in people, because we're not going to be able to achieve that equity
Right.
in any way, whether that be racial equity, gender equity. That's part of, those are intersections of sexual violence that do have to be addressed.
Absolutely. And so for me, it's fair your turning point continue to expound on its current programs and practices to ensure we're meeting the need. Not getting so complacent in what we're doing, but always looking for ways to evolve. Conducting focus groups so you can get feedback directly. It's great to have individuals who, not great that it happened, but if you've experienced sexual assault, you know how to work with others who are coming through your doors that have experience. But who better to hear from than the clients? They'll tell you directly what they need, and then using our position as an established agency to elevate their voices. To continue to create safe spaces for advocates. With me working with TCFB, having BIPOC gatherings so that advocates can get what they need so they can go back out and give clients what they need. It's amazing the stories that you hear participating in those groups in an anti-violence movement. In some agencies, people are genuinely experiencing forms of violence that are oppressing them as well, which directly impacts the clients that are being served. So it's just mind-boggling. We did a whole survey about that, but I won't go too far down that path. To make sure that I'm using my voice. I have a big mouth. I don't mind. I believe you are your biggest advocate. I believe that you should advocate for yourself. You don't have to advocate it. Not to be as verbal as I am. Everybody has their own way. I believe you're your biggest advocate. And I also think people perish for lack of knowledge. So educating, informing, elevating conversations. To me, that's going to be what we need to change. But it's on multiple levels. It's on the advocacy and the criminal justice side. But we also have individuals who there's housing disparities with the BIPOC community, just like we're talking about disparities with sexual assault awareness and prevention. There are disparities, making sure I have the Waukeshas at the table to make sure to talk about how on this Epitform, if you were impacted by sexual assault, right, then that needs to elevate your score if you're a dual victim, having staff that can use their knowledge to push forward on the EPIFORM, which is a housing tool that we use to prioritize. If you're Black, because there's so many housing disparities, you get extra points. If you come from the Asian Pacific Island community, there's something to give credit there to elevate the need for housing, right? If you couple that with I'm also a victim of sexual assault, we can move those individuals out and address that disparity. We talk about mental health, right? We have how many counselors in this building? Three positions, our manager and counselors,
Yeah.
and there's a wait list. We don't even capture the ethnicity of those individuals when we talk about lack of mental health. Using hiring people and training them so they can then bring us back information to make sure we're not missing them on that. In our shelter, which is primarily Black, then Hispanic, then white. That's the population in our shelter of demographic and priority of them. We see more Black people, then Hispanic, and then white. Making sure, because those are the individuals that have nowhere to go. And they've been impacted by domestic violence and sexual assault. So making sure that we're having Corey and Sybil and everyone else and Kat raising money so that we can bring in the funds to make sure that we're not missing anything that we need. And so for me, it's making sure at Bay Area Turning Point, we're evolving to make sure from housing to advocacy, being in the shelter to mental health, right? That we're addressing the needs of survivors and beyond that. But then also in development, when they go out in the community to make sure they're elevating the need as well. We're not just asking you to give us money, just to give us money. We're asking you to respond to a societal need, which all of us are impacted by. Even in finance, them understanding how what they do directly impacts. So it's the connection. It's the connection. It's making sure people understand. It's using our voice. It's elevating the conversation. And it's being bold in your convictions. Saying things that other people will not say or don't want to say or that are scared to say. As long as Bay Area Turning Point is operating to advocate to end domestic and sexual violence, we all have a responsibility, no matter where you are in the organization, whether you be a board member or client or a staff person, we all have a responsibility to respond. And the connection is getting everybody to understand that, getting on platforms like the the Sexual Assault Task Force, the BIPOC Space Gathering, housing entities, and using your voice in a way that brings it all together.
Wow. I was about to say, does anybody have any closing thoughts? But I don't even think we can beat that. But I will ask, do you have any closing thoughts?
Honestly, nothing that I can think of. I'm sure as soon as we shut this off, I'll be like, "Oh, wait."
Right?
I'll always first my phone.
Well, thank you, Brenda. This was a very eye-opening conversation. I hope everybody that's watching got something from this today. And until then, oh, wait, no, shameless plug here. We have our Light Up the Night event coming up on Thursday, April 20th at Clear Lake Park from 5:30 to 8. We hope to see you all there. This is a free event. It is open to the public. It should be a lot of fun. And then we also have our Sexual Assault Awareness Month karaoke and open mic night at Java Owl on April 28th from 6:30 to 8:30. Hope to see y'all there, and thank you for joining.
And if you know someone that's in need, please have them call our 24-hour hotline at 281-286-2525. If you want to learn more about what we do, visit our website at www.bayareaturningpoint.org. And if you want to support us in any manner, if you want us to come present, if you want to come tour to see where your money goes, just please reach out to us and we'll make sure that we respond to your request. Thank you so much for having us.